Hello everyone, my name is Daniel and I'm just a casual sim racer, and today I'm going to be presenting to you 5 tracks that should be created for a sim racing title. First, the Twin City Motor Speedway. This track existed from 1915 through 1917 and was located near Minneapolis. As speed became king, dirt tracks began to spring up everywhere across the United States, sometimes even in farmers' cow pastures or just on a spare stretch of road. Aware of the great interest in the sport, the Minnesota State Fair Board sponsored its first auto race in 1907 on the dirt oval used for horse racing in the city. The following year, an auto race was the feature attraction at the fair, and soon the event was drawing famous drivers who followed the race circuits. Auto racing was here to stay. Investors were also building a new hard-tracked surface, resulting in Indianapolis Motor Speedway. By 1914, the track's founders were looking around for another racing site and had settled on Minnesota. Correspondence shows that at least 2 of Indianapolis' principals launched this venture: Carl Fisher, an entrepreneur and auto dealer, and Frank Wheeler, owner of the Schiebler Carburetor Company. After considerable wrangling, the Twin City Motor Speedway opened on Labor Day weekend, 1915. The track was 2 miles in length. The direction was counterclockwise, and it promised on its opening day program to give citizens of the entire West the opportunity to enjoy the most thrilling of all modern sports. Promoters boasted that the new 2-mile concrete oval, with its uniform thickness of 6 inches, was a world-class superspeedway, surpassing even the famous Indianapolis track, and that it would withstand years of racing and permit speeds not previously attained anywhere in the world. Its inaugural contest would be the first annual 500-mile Motor Derby, which owners touted as the race for the Speed Championship of the World. A Minneapolis Journal headline predicted, $1 million Speedway will attract thousands Saturday, and the next day's paper declared, drivers set for Auto Derby start. Track officials had talked of many entrants for the time trials and expected to eliminate those not qualifying at 84 miles per hour. However, to the great disappointment of those who purchased tickets, and even more so to the track promoters, only 14 drivers entered the race. Then, the fancy box seats and much of the grandstand went unsold. Only 25,000 spectators saw the race, which proved to be something of an upset. Cooper took the $20,000 first prize, while fellow Stutz driver Anderson collected $10,000 for second place. More ominous for investors than the low opening day attendance was the news, as the next day's paper reported, that the track, raw, new, and completed with no time to polish it up, was a disappointment. The speeds were not up to expectation, and drivers complained that the rough concrete surface caused nearly uncontrollable vibrations in their cars. After the initial 500-mile race, which was held in 1915, a 150-mile race was held in 1916 that counted for the AAA championship season that was held that year. Another 50-mile race, along with a 100-mile race, was held over the course of one weekend in 1917. After that, the track lay idle. Unfortunately, the winters of 1915 and 1916 had not been kind to its surface, which was found to be quite defective. The Twin City Motor Speedway was a track that was forced to fade into history, and I hope one day it will rise again as a virtual track in a sim racing title. The Autodromo Internacional de Luanda, Angola, was a track that existed in Angola from 1972 through 1975, and has been somewhat restored and is used from 2007 to the present. However, the version of the track that I am going to refer to is the 1970s version. This track was the second permanent circuit in Angola. When it first opened in 1972, the track was hailed as the most sophisticated circuit of its type in the entire world, and it was used as a template for many modern circuits that followed. The track in the Angolan capital boasted an Indianapolis-style oval course, multi-configuration road course, and all the modern amenities of the day, including an electronic marshalling system. The circuit is driven clockwise and has 5 different layouts available, with an oval layout of 3.2 kilometers being the shortest and the largest being 6.28 kilometers, or 3.9 miles. The circuit began life as an exercise in colonial one-upmanship. With Portugal building the Estoril circuit in hopes of attracting a Formula One Grand Prix, the authorities in Angola were keen not to be left behind and launched their own ambitious scheme. The project was announced as the biggest sporting tourism investment on the continent and unparalleled in the world, complete with apartments, shops, and casinos. And what a better way to steal the headlines than by employing the same architect who had penned Estoril to design the whole facility and to finish it first. So it was that the Angolan company Autodromo entrusted the project to Arten Cornelson with a challenging deadline for completion of May the following year. As an incentive, Autodromo granted the architect Cornelson a stake of 7% of all revenue created by the project. Unsurprisingly, the track was completed on time. Work soon began with construction permits approved by the Ministry of Construction. Among the innovations pioneered at Luanda were the first gravel traps seen anywhere in the world, which impressed Emerson Fittipaldi when he inspected the facility in March 1972. The track and its associated facilities, including an impressive control tower, modern pits, and a large grandstand on the start-finish straight, was finished and ready to host its first race on May 28, 1972, 3 weeks before the racetrack in Estoril. The first race was won by an Angolan racer, Helder de Sousa, in a Ford Capri GT, in front of a capacity crowd which had packed the circuit from early morning throughout the day. While the sports cars and GT races would attract some overseas competitors and prove successful in their own right over the next 2.5 years, Luanda's summer in the sun for international racing was really quite brief. The hype over its opening began to fade quickly, and infighting in 1974 led to the cancellation of most of the track's events that year. But worse was yet to come. The outbreak of civil war following the country's independence from Portugal in 1975 led to anti-colonial rebels seizing power. All Portuguese enterprises were nationalized, forcing Lola to leave Angola and motor racing ground to a halt. The facility was taken over by the military and later the police as a training facility, and it seemed unlikely ever to return to its motor racing glory. However, fast forward more than 20 years and the sound of racing engines reverberate once again around the facility. And this has a positive ending after so many sad years. But it would be epic to see this track come to life as a virtual track in a sim racing title, highlighting the several years of its motor racing glory in the 70s. An American board racetrack. Board track racing was a type of motorsport popular in the United States during the 1910s and 1920s. Competitions were conducted on circular or oval racecourses with the surfaces composed of wooden planks. These tracks were also called motordromes, after the motorcycle competitions that were first held there. Then they were adapted for use by various kinds of racing cars. The majority of American National Championship races were contested at such venues during the 1920s, as it was the most common track in the United States during that period of time. Board tracks proliferated in part because they were inexpensive to construct, but ultimately they lacked durability and required a great deal of maintenance to remain usable. Most of the tracks survived for as little as 3 years before they were abandoned. Further, the onset of the Great Depression in the early 1930s, the tracks began to disappear more rapidly. However, their influence is still felt in American motorsports. A technical emphasis on raw speed produced by steep banking, ample track width to allow steady overtaking between competitors, and the ubiquitous oval-style racing that is found within the United States all began on the board tracks. The first board track for motor racing was the circular Los Angeles Motordrome, built in 1910 in the area that would later become the city's Playa del Rey district. Based on the same technology as the European velodromes used for bicycle racing, this track and others like it were constructed with 2-inch by 4-inch boards, often with turns banked at up to 45 degrees. In some cases, such as the track at Culver City, banking was 50 degrees or more. Longer tracks were later built, some up to 2 miles, and lap speeds exceeded 100 miles per hour. Interest in motorsports in the United States was exploding during the 1920s, and by 1929 at least 24 board tracks had been built around the country. Unfortunately, by 1931, 20 of those had been shut down or abandoned, and by 1932, there was no championship-level races ran on a board track. The costs for the 2-mile Tacoma Speedway was just $100,000 in 1915, compared to the $700,000 spent 6 years earlier in 1909 just to pave the 2.5-mile Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Racing on these tracks often drew large crowds of paying spectators. In 1915, a crowd of 80,000 people was reported in Chicago, 3 weeks after only 60,000 had attended the Indianapolis 500. Relatively small and isolated Tacoma had turned out 35,000 to see a race the year before. To attract both competitors and fans, race promoters offered what was then considered sensational amounts of money. A total purse of $25,000 was not unusual. After World War I, the Automobile Association of America's Contest Board resumed and reorganized the national championship system. From the beginning of the 1920 season to the end of 1931, the AAA sanctioned a total of 123 championship racing events on 24 different racetracks. 82 of the 123 championship racing events were run on wooden board tracks. Much of American racing owes part of its legacy to the board tracks, and therefore it would be fitting for a board track to make its way to a sim racing title. Autodromo di Modena was a track that existed from 1915 to 1975. Today there exists a modern track that shares a similar name, however it is not the same track. Autodromo di Modena was a racetrack on the edge of Modena in Italy. The track had a length of 2.4 kilometers or 1.5 miles. It was opened in 1915, and the circuit was crossed by an airstrip of about a mile in length or 1.6 kilometers. And this airstrip was used by the local flying club. The track hosted 9 editions of the Modena Grand Prix for Formula One and Formula Two racing cars. The last event was held in 1961. Meanwhile, the circuit continued to host other racing events such as sports cars, Grand Touring, Formula Junior, and motorcycles until 1975. In the 1960s and 70s, the track also served as a test track for Ferrari and Maserati during the morning or afternoon on weekdays. At other times of the day, it was used by residents of the adjacent military camp for driver training while maintaining its original function of an airport for private flights. Ferrari driver Mike Parks, an accomplished pilot, used to fly in regularly from England on his own craft. Despite the expansion of nearby Modena, which involved the proliferation of apartment blocks and electricity pylons, the airstrip continued to be a favored venue for a number of local aerobatics enthusiasts until 1974. In the early 1970s, Enzo Ferrari, aided and abetted by Maserati, demanded an upgrade from the Modena Town Council, an automobile club. The reasoning being that the racetrack lacked basic safety requirements and was inadequate to test modern racing cars. The proposal was initially discussed with interest, but eventually stalled due to the lack of political will. Frustrated by the lack of progress in the negotiations, Ferrari then proceeded to buy the land adjacent to his factory and build the Foriano circuit. This is a 3,000-meter track that is still in use to test Ferrari racing and road cars. Ultimately, in 1972, the Automobile Club d'Italia decided to invest in the nearby semi-permanent Imola circuit, effectively ending Modena's perspective of holding a modern Formula One race. The circuit was subsequently demolished, and the site redeveloped as a public park to honor Enzo Ferrari in 1991. This is a unique track that hosted Formula One racing, and one that I hope many of you would be excited to have come to a sim racing title. Santa Monica Road Races. These races ran from 1909 to 1919 as part of a program to put Santa Monica on the map. The circuit length was 8 miles long, and the track was comprised of public roads with a hard-packed earth surface. The roads used were St. Vincent Boulevard, Ocean Avenue, and Wilshire Boulevard, which formed a triangular-shaped course. At the time the races began, Santa Monica was little more than a village, with a population of 7,000. Today, the city has a population of 90,000. While near neighbor Los Angeles was much larger, and even Venice was much more developed. The cars that ran in the 200-mile-long races were usually stripped-down road cars, powered by huge aero engines of around 900 cubic inches, almost 15 liters, many of them chain-driven. European cars were fairly prominent, and included such cars as Fiat. Although slow to get on the pace, starting grids were soon full of American cars, like Stutz and Mercer. In spite of their vast engine size, these cars were only capable of reaching a little over 90 miles per hour on the long straights available, which was just as well considering the road surface they raced on. These early cars had wooden spoked wheels that could disintegrate at any second, and often did. The highlight of the Santa Monica street races were the Vanderbilt Cup races, which were held in 1914 and 1916. Additionally, the American Grand Prize races were also held in 1914 and 1916 at the course. Over the years, 15 AAA recognized races were held on the streets of Santa Monica. In 1914, Ralph Del Palma would win the Vanderbilt Cup driving his Schroeder Mercedes, while in 1916, Dario Resta would win the Vanderbilt Cup driving his Peugeot. Over time, the track would slowly lose favor with the city. As it grew and it became more populated, citizens did not enjoy having the streets occupied for races. However, it would be thrilling to have once again another racetrack join a virtual sim racing title so we could once again race through the streets of Santa Monica in the early years of automotive racing.